If we could begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of the faithful, enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, anytime I'm behind a microphone, I'm reminded of the famous portly British writer and convert, because I fit those descriptions as well, G.K. Chesterton. And he often would say, I'm not as large as I look. The microphone is amplifying me. I'd like to do something a little unconventional here and ask all of those. In Europe, when we talk about youth, Europeans look as youth as anyone 39 and under. But for personal reasons, I'm going to adapt that to 40. And if you are 40 or younger, I would like to ask you to stand for a moment, please. As Pope John Paul II the Great would say, you are the hope of the church. Thank you. It's very easy, I think, to get bogged down by some of the bad news in the church, and I think it's good for us to remember that Christ came to bring the good news, not the bad. We could sit and spend time talking about the dissension, the division, the priestly sexual abuse crisis, the crisis on Catholic college campuses, with Catholic hospitals, with Catholic charities, cafeteria Catholicism, all of these things. But I think that looking at those things is a rather myopic view of the church. For the church is much larger than all of its human problems. And as we heard yesterday from Father Benedict Groeschel and also from Bishop Morlino, who spent a great deal of time really talking about the history that we have dealt with here in the church in recent years. And I'm here today to talk about its present and its future. The misconception, unfortunately, it goes something like this. It's like seeing the church as half empty rather than half full. And it was a similar lament that led me to do the research for my book, Young and Catholic, The Face of Tomorrow's Church. If we listen to the media, the secular media sources, these are the stories that they tend to tell us about the young, or the youth, and their relationship with the church. They have a mantra, and if you read through these headlines, young Catholics embrace Jesus' message, not practices. Odyssey Catholics, young and restless, tenuously connected to their faith, and many millennials claim parish membership, few attend. This tends to be the overall view of the media in general, and it seems that when they report stories on those who are involved in the church, those stories tend to concentrate on the disagreements. Something that I've coined a phrase for, I call it the WOCA mantra, W-O-C-H-A. Stands for women's ordination, contraception, homosexuality, and abortion. The issues, and I saw this, I've been to 2 World Youth Days, and I saw this as a reporter in Cologne when journalists would approach young people and they would talk to them about their participation in World Youth Day, but inevitably they would go to the WOCA mantra and they would start asking the questions, well, what do you think about the church's teaching about women's ordination? What do you think about the church's teaching on abortion? And it seems that is all that the secular media in some ways is able to concentrate on, and so there's a lot that they miss. The Pew study, which came out a few weeks ago, and many of you I'm sure have heard about, did have some startling statistics that Americans change churches, and that of those raised Catholic, about 1/3 have left the church. But again, I don't think that these statistics tell the full story. Now, day in, day out, our family tries to make an honest effort to attend daily Mass. And it's something we've done for several years. Sometimes we're successful, other times we're not. And we have 5 young children, so you'll understand. And early on, I used to note that our family of 7 made up about 1/5 of the congregation. And we were the only ones who were present who were younger than 40. And it made me wonder, where are the young in the church? Now, granted, this is during the week, so many of them are at school or at work. And so that led me to do the research that I did. And since that time, I've interviewed somewhere between 400 and 600 young people and young adults. And I'm very encouraged by the things that they tell me and by their practice of the faith. And I'm here to tell you that there's great hope for the future of the church, as we saw here demonstrated by the numbers who stood. And while the young may not be sitting next to us in the pews at daily Mass, they're often active in the church in a variety of other ways. Let's look at some overall numbers. Catholic Church by the numbers. You can see that the U.S. Catholic population has actually remained steady, between 23 and 25% of the total, largely due to converts and immigration. And between 2005 and 2006, the last years that we have records for, there was an increase of about 1.4%, with the largest increases in Africa and Asia. I want you to think for a minute, what would you say are the 2 largest gatherings of Catholic young people that we have examples of? World Youth Day, and would anyone offer another suggestion? The March for Life, wonderful. Yes, the March for Life and World Youth Day. And it's really not surprising, is it, that these 2 events are the 2 events that, by and large, the secular media tends to really avoid. It's almost as if they put a media blackout on the events, especially the March for Life. So I'm here to present 7 reasons for hope. 7 ways that young people are indeed engaged with the church. First of all, teens. The common misconception is that teens are interested primarily in their looks, in material things, and hanging out at the mall. But if you talk to them, they'll tell you another thing, that they really do desire to live for something other than themselves. And if they are given opportunities, they will rise to the occasion to serve something other than themselves. And while the pews may look graying or empty, we need to understand that the young are sometimes involved in masses that we are not at. All right? And these masses often are on Saturday evenings, Sunday evenings. They're taking places in cathedrals around the country, especially on Sunday evenings. So taking places, Life Teen, which many of you I'm sure have heard of, which is around the world, and very active in places like Atlanta, Duluth, Chicago. And young people are gathering by the hundreds, and in some cases the thousands, for Mass. But it's not on Sunday morning. And you can think about that. There's a natural reason for that. Okay, they're often up late on Saturday nights. So, and I'm going to go through, you're going to see through this slideshow different lists. And because I'm amongst so many religious, please don't be offended if you don't see your organization or religious order or diocese on the list, all right? I'm just going to throw out a bunch, and you'll get the sense of what's going on. I want to give you an overall picture of what's going on in the church, because I think too often we just see what's happening locally. And so you have all these different groups: Life Teen, Net Ministries, Denver's Young Adult Masses, the Frazzati Society, Dead Theologian Society. These are all teen or young adult outreach groups that are active around the country, and they often have masses at different times than Sunday mornings. And I mentioned missionary activity and the desire to serve something other than themselves. And these are some examples of these types of activities. You've got Fargo's Young Disciples teams, Youth for the Third Millennium, Totus Tuus, NET teams. And what's taking place in these groups is young people are giving up of their own time, oftentimes on special occasions like spring break or Holy Week, and they're going either to other countries, could be Mexico, but sometimes they're going to communities within the United States where they're doing peer-to-peer outreach and evangelization. That's what's happening in Fargo and throughout North Dakota. That is what the NET teams do as well. Youth for the Third Millennium go both to Latin American countries as well as cities in the United States. And I remember talking to a young woman by the name of Sarah Bollinger. She was a high school student, and after after the landslides that took place, it was either Nicaragua or Ecuador, I can't remember, a few years ago, she decided to hold a bake sale to raise money for the poor and those who had been affected by that disaster. And she got some friends together, and their organization was called Amigos for Christ. And after doing one bake sale, they did another, and another, and another, and they started finding other ways to raise money. And to this point, they've raised somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million. Okay. So these are the ways that young people are active in the church. And Youth for the Third Millennium, who's pictured in this photograph, goes out to inner city parishes in places like Atlanta, Denver, Calgary, Chicago, Miami, Phoenix, Sacramento, and oftentimes they go door to door, evangelizing to Catholics who have fallen away, or sometimes the parish will give them lists of Catholics who belong to the parish but perhaps haven't been seen in the parish for a long time. Then we have number 2, what's happening on college campuses. And there's a steady growth in faith-based efforts on college campuses, both Catholic and secular. In fact, 2 of the largest Catholic campus efforts are at non-Catholic schools. Texas A&M, which has the St. Mary's Student Center, and the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And at the University of Illinois Champaign, I've been told that they actually have dorms which are set aside for Catholic students, that there are several Catholic Bible studies going on campus, and this is really quite remarkable for non-Catholic campuses. You also have the growth of chastity groups, especially at places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and then the groups that you're probably more familiar with, Focus, Compass, and other college outreach groups. But you also have a renewal that's taking place on Catholic college campuses. Okay? And while I hate to use this terminology, Bishop Morlino talked about it last night, I like using it in this way, that these schools that you see listed, most of these on this list, are pre-Vatican II campuses. You get what I'm saying there. I'm using that in a different sense, a different way. And they're experiencing profound renewals, of course. Franciscan University of Steubenville, Benedictine, DeSales, Belmont Abbey, University of St. Thomas in Houston, and I could go on, at least another 5 or 6 that I could mention. And then, of course, you have the rise of the new Catholic colleges. Ave Maria, Southern Catholic College, Thomas Aquinas, Wyoming. And this is really quite startling if you think about it. Think of what's involved in starting a university. No small endeavor. And yet over the past 30 years, we've seen the rise of at least a dozen schools, all of which embrace Ex Corde Ecclesiae in a more profound way and in a full way. You also have young adult groups. And for those young adults who aren't coming to church, what they're doing is they're going out to meet them where they are. And sometimes those places are restaurants and bars. Okay, the first group on the list, Theology on Tap, which started locally in the Archdiocese of Chicago. which is now active in 46 states and 5 countries around the world. And it's really quite remarkable, if you think about it, that young people are gathering on a semi-regular basis to talk about theology in a bar. All right? Then, of course, you've got the theology of the body study groups. Many of these came out of Denver, but they are around the U.S. now. Love and responsibility discussion groups, which started primarily in New York and Manhattan, where young adults were getting together to discuss John Paul II's love and responsibility. You've got, of course, the Catholic Underground, which is a music and Eucharistic adoration ministry in New York. And then, of course, small faith communities and a lot of the new ecclesial realities, which have youth groups of their own. Communion and Liberation, Opus Dei, Neo-Catechumenal Way. Papal biographer George Weigel described in his biography of Pope John Paul II, he said that the theology of the body was a time bomb set to go off in the new millennium. And it really is the Pope's teaching, which is an antidote to the sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s. And young adult discussion groups from Manhattan to Denver have ignited the fuse on that bomb by gathering to discuss the Pope's thoughts. I think something that's interesting to think about in all of this is that for that group of people that stood up, the fight that the church has seen, that many of us have witnessed over the past 30, 40 years, is not their fight. The young people, first of all, don't really understand it. Secondly, they're really not interested in it. What they're interested in is following Christ. And so I think that's important for us to think about as we look to the types of ministries that we want to provide for young people. And really, this shouldn't be a surprise to us. The young, in many senses, when I talk with them, they have a deep desire for obedience and for traditions because of what they've grown up with. At least 1/3 of their generation doesn't exist because of abortion. Nearly 50% of them come from broken homes and families because of divorce. I remember a priest from the southern United States telling me that the church he grew up in the late 60s was different from the church in the 1970s, was different from the church in the 1980s. So it should be no surprise that young people are desiring some stability. And of course, these young people are graduating from college, and they are just beginning to enter into leadership positions within dioceses and colleges and churches across the country and the world. This group that's pictured here, I was fortunate enough to meet down in Sydney last September. And they're a group of young people who have given up this year to work as volunteers, preparing for World Youth Day this July. Now, in the next series of slides, I'm not going to be telling most of you anything that you don't already know, those of you in consecrated and religious life. But because it is a story that the secular media doesn't tend to tell, it's something that I mention quite a bit when I'm out talking with lay groups. And I think it is a great surprise to many of them that the young actually are indeed choosing religious life. This is a very recent statistic from the second annual survey on trends in religious vocation. Very promising. It said the Catholic religious communities reported on average a 30% increase this past year in the number of individuals in initial formation, the period before final vows. In addition, 62% of participating communities reported an increase in vocation inquiries in the past year. And I remember this same group published a statistic last year which was very similar. All right? So it tells a story that is promising. And some more good news that was from that same survey was that the majority of those who are considering religious life are under 30. and quite serious about choosing religious life. About 1 in 5 plan on entering a religious community in the next year, while another 64% are seriously considering it. All right, so where are the religious? And I'm going to go through these next slides very quickly because most of you know where they are. Father Benedict Rochelle, of course, who was with us yesterday, so the New York Franciscan Friars of the Renewal. And I put this slide in there only because it's my favorite. Of Brother Pio Maria, who I happened to meet in Cologne at World Youth Day, in the restroom of all places. But you can't mistake a Franciscan Friar of Renewal, the gray habit, the long beard. And I struck up a conversation with him. And he told me about how he used his skateboard to go around the Bronx and distribute miraculous medals and evangelize to poor children on the street. And here he is at a gymnasium gathering, leaping over 3 priests. Of course, the Order of Preachers, especially in the Western Province. Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother, I'm obligated to put in here because one of them is a godmother to our firstborn son. The Norbertine Fathers, Nashville Dominicans, the monks at Clear Creek, and many, many others. My apologies to those of you who I didn't include. New York Sisters of Life, Ann Arbor Sisters of Mary Mother of the Eucharist, the Little Sisters of the Poor, Carmelite Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and they go on and on. Point number 4, young Catholics are connecting online. I don't really like technology, but I realize that I better get used to it or I won't be able to compete, right? And whereas television really was the method of the medium of choice for my generation and those before, the internet really is the medium of choice for the young. And think about it, young people are connected 24/7. They've got their iPods, their internet connections, their blogs, their Palm Pilots, their cell phones. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but what we have to recognize is that it's a reality, and that it is something that we need to keep in mind if we are trying to reach out to young people. Technology can be a hindrance to the faith, but it can also be used as a connecting point or an aid to the faith. And perhaps no one exemplifies this better than Pope John Paul II, who a number of years ago began the practice of sending out daily inspirational messages via cell phones in Europe. I don't know if they're accessible here. And other examples of the faith online. The Jesuits have created an online presence in the virtual community Second Life. It's not something I recommend, Second Life. I think you should live your first life. That should be enough for all of us. But to be a presence to these people, young people who are online, they've created a religious presence. Then you have a plethora of websites where young people can go online and communicate with other young people, where they can learn about their faith not in an intimidating way. Sites like Busted Halo, Next Wave Faithful, they go on and on. And then, of course, you have the rise of social networking sites like MySpace, Facebook. And this is one of our diocesan priests, Father Aaron Kuhn, who uses his Facebook page. He is a priest at a Newman Center in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And he uses his web page to communicate not only with young people, but with parishioners, to tell them of upcoming events, to tell them where he's traveling, things of that nature. And you have youth ministers who are really making great use of this. I had just read a story in the Register. It wasn't one I wrote. About youth minister, particularly there was one in Faribault, who says this really has been his means of communicating with young people to tell them about youth gatherings and events. So whether we like the technology or not, it's being used. And then, of course, you have the Catholic internet dating sites, of which there are a good half dozen. And at first you might roll your eyes and say, Catholic internet dating sites? But they play an important role. And think about it. You go online and you have a questionnaire that you have to fill out. And this questionnaire asks a number of questions, some of them quite detailed about your practice of the faith and what it is that you believe. So when you're jumping online, you can look at the other people's profiles and find out, oh yeah, well this person tends to look at things the same way that I do. And then they go a step further and they are entering into sacramental Catholic marriages and raising families of their own. And because of these sites, you've literally hundreds of marriages that have come about, and in many cases, for young people who may have thought that they were never going to get married. And I've spoken to a number of, especially women in their 30s, who they said, well, I didn't want to post, on an internet dating site, but my mom or my dad did it for me. And they ended up meeting someone and getting married. And this couple you see in the picture, Mike and Tina, were very much that way, in their early 30s, and she didn't think that she was going to ever get married, and lo and behold, she has. Praise God. Point number 5, priestly vocations. Now again, the only story that the secular media tells us is that priestly vocations are on the decline. What they don't tell us is the following. They don't tell us that the number of diocesan seminarians has increased 15% since the late 1990s. They don't tell us about places, probably because they don't know that they exist, places like Tulsa, Bismarck, Rapid City, Atlanta, Charlotte, Baltimore, and elsewhere, where the seminary numbers not only are on the rise, but where you have, because of the per capita Catholic population, it's a considerable number of priests per the Catholic population in those areas. And then you see some of the seminarians here from St. John Vianney Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And in 2005, the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis ordained its largest class in 35 years. That previous picture was a picture of that. And this is not only taking place in the Twin Cities, but it's taking place in places like Baltimore and Denver and elsewhere. You also have the creation of pre-theologate programs, which is a somewhat new development. These are active at places like Ave Maria University and Franciscan University, where they have consistently, for the past number of years, had anywhere between 35 and 45 young men discerning a possible priestly vocation while they are attending college and living the life of a college student. The number of religious and diocesan priests has steadily increased from 2000 to 2006, with 406,411 priests worldwide in 2005, and up to 407,262 in 2006. And students of philosophy and theology in diocesan religious seminaries number 115,480, an increase of 0.9% from year-end 2005. So increases. And it's important, I think, also to recognize that the priests that we are getting are a little bit different breed of priest. That's not meant in a comparison way. What it's meant is that they're really bound together by a love for the Church, for the Blessed Mother, for the teachings of the Church, the magisterium, and the Pope. And in fact, many of the young men talk about the role that Pope John Paul II made in their own decision to choose the priesthood. And then here is just a graphic representation of some of those numbers, which, rather than showing an overall decline, shows a slight increase. And then my two final points, which I will spend probably the greatest amount of time talking about, are World Youth Day and the popes. And they really are inseparable, since World Youth Day was the idea of Pope John Paul II, despite what many bishops told him that it would never work. World Youth Day we have to look at as the epicenter of the Catholic youth movement. And it's interesting to see how the media covers World Youth Day. I remember prior to Toronto, remember that was following 9/11, the media said that the young people wouldn't show up because of the difficulties with travel, and also because they said that Pope John Paul II was ailing, and so the young people wouldn't show up. But they did. And then, after Pope John Paul passed, they said that the young people wouldn't show up in Cologne because John Paul wouldn't be there. And yet they did, and in fact in greater numbers than they did in Toronto. All right. I remember the story that Cardinal Francis George told about going to Rome as John Paul II was dying. And he said he went down into St. Peter's Square and he started talking with the young people. And he said, why have you come all this way, to be with the Pope? And they replied to him that they came because he came to them first, in Paris, in Toronto, in the Philippines, in Denver. And I think that's very interesting that the most effective youth minister in the world wasn't a fresh college graduate, but someone in his 80s. And I'm reminded of several stories that I'd like to share from World Youth Day. The one that really sticks in my mind is I was crossing a bridge in Cologne, and all of a sudden, tearing from behind me came about 6 or 7 young people, and they were running at top speed to cross this rather congested bridge. And I remember looking at them and thinking, where in the world are they headed to in such a hurry? And here up ahead was Bishop Schnur from Duluth walking with, I believe, 1 or 2 other bishops. And these young people ran up, and as soon as they got to the bishops, they got in front and they kneeled down and asked for the bishop's blessings. And the bishops just instinctively blessed each one of them. And I just remember that story. It sticks in my head because it was just a brilliant example of the faith of young people. And I also remember being trapped, if you will, in some of the train stations, particularly in Cologne. And I don't really like crowds all that much. But this particular crowd was inside the train station, and there was absolutely no movement. They were not allowing young people to go up the ramps onto the platform. And so there I was in this congregation of young people, body to body, and I was starting to get claustrophobic. And, whereas I would be prone to start cursing, perhaps, these young people started praying and singing in their different languages. And it was another beautiful example. And I, worried that I'm going to pass out, took my case and held it above my head and said, I need to pass through this group now. And they separated, and I got through. Now, World Youth Day, if you think of it just in terms of numbers, for 19 years, more than 12 million youth have accepted the invitation to spend a week with the Holy Father at the World Youth Days. And of course, we'll have another gathering here in July in Sydney. And there are some who like to look at World Youth Day and say, oh, well, it's just an emotional high. They go there and, what sort of long-term impact does that have? And they describe it as almost a Catholic Woodstock. And I would say it's a lot more than that. Because each one is set up like a mini Easter. And it's an invitation for young people to encounter Christ and take up the cross and to spend a week with the Holy Father, to listen to His words, the gospel, to engage with the sacraments, prayer, adoration, confession. And I would argue that it's a lot more than a flash in the pan, and I'll offer you some examples for why that is. I remember in Cologne talking with Milwaukee Archbishop Timothy Dolan, and he used to be the rector at the North American College in Rome. And in that position, he had to read through the applicants for all of those young men, seminary candidates, who were considering entering. And he told me that among those applicants, he said that at least 50% of the applicants mentioned the significant impact that World Youth Day had for them in their discernment process. At least 50%. I also am reminded of a call I made for a story I was working on about the impact of World Youth Day in Denver. And I spoke with a sister, and I think it was a Sister John Paul, at Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. And she told me about how her involvement in World Youth Day in Denver played a critical role for her in discerning her vocation. And I was ready to hang up, and she said, "Oh, no, don't hang up yet." She said, "There's another sister here I want you to talk to." And so I talked to a second sister who told me a very similar but different story. And then that sister said, "Wait, I don't want you to hang up. There's another sister I want you to talk to." And by the time the phone call was done, an hour and a half later, I believe I had talked to 3 or 4 young women who all told me very similar stories about the impact that World Youth Day had on them. Okay? And then, of course, you have the creation of many, many different apostolates that have sprung from World Youth Day. Some of these are drama groups. Some of them are youth outreach programs. Some are online organizations that reach out to youth. And so I would argue it's much more than simply a flash in the pan. And this isn't a story that's just being told by me. My book's in the bottom left, but the other books are not mine. The Tide is Turning Toward Catholicism by David Hartline, which came out within the past year. God on the Quad by Naomi Schaefer Riley. The New Faithful by Colleen Carroll Campbell, which was one of the first in this series of books, are also on the market, and they tell very similar stories. John Woodward talked about the new evangelization. It's a phrase that we've all heard. John Paul II, on May 11th, 1991, said, "A new missionary age will arise, a new springtime for the church." And in summary, I would argue that we are in the very beginnings of that new springtime, and that the seeds have been sown, that they're being fertilized by Pope Benedict, who, with such amazing clarity, is calling us back to the basics of the faith and Jesus Christ in so many wonderful ways, and that those seeds will continue to grow and bear fruit. So, but we may be asking, well, what is it that's happening in the church? We've got these disparate numbers, the different stories that are being told. And I think one thing we need to think about is that we in America tend to look at things in terms of size, don't we? We think that bigger is better. And I'm very convinced that that's not quite the case. And we only have to think of how Christ came into the world to realize that that's not the case. That he came into the world little. And that in many ways we are called to be little. And so it's not surprising that some of these new ecclesial realities, that some of these new religious orders, that some of these colleges, while numerous, are small. And what is it that we are experiencing? In Pope Benedict's book, Jesus of Nazareth, he has this quote: "The vine constantly needs purification. Purification, the church and the individual need constant purification. Processes of purification which are as necessary as they are painful run through the whole of history, the whole life of those who have dedicated themselves to Christ. When man and his institutions climb too high, they need to be cut back. What has become too big must be brought back to the simplicity and poverty of the Lord himself. It is only by undergoing such processes of dying away that fruitfulness endures and renews itself." And in addition to the purification, I believe we're also experiencing a reordering. Christ said, "If I am lifted up, I will draw all men to me." And that really is at the heart of what we see going on as part of this renewal. I want to end by asking a question which Bishop Morlino also asked last night, and that is, do we believe that the Holy Spirit is still at work within the church? Do we truly believe that? Pope John Paul II said early on, to not be afraid. And we can't let the media doomsayers allow us to believe that the young are abandoning the faith whole scale. The church's new springtime is at hand, and the Holy Spirit continues to move and work much as he did when he fell upon a young Jewish girl in Nazareth more than 2,000 years ago. And I will end with Pope Benedict saying, which he said shortly after his election, that the church is always young. Thank you.